Hi, this is Rebecca from Oregon, co-host of the podcast End Times Pep Talk, and you're listening to, as Rachel Maddow likes to say, Joyce Vance from the great state of Alabama on Two Broads Talking Politics. Now go vote!
Hi, everyone. This is Kelly with Two Broads Talking Politics. And today I'm excited to have on with me Joyce Vance, who is a distinguished professor of the practice of law at the University of Alabama Law School. And she's also a former U.S. attorney. Hi, Joyce.
Hi.
Thanks so much for joining me today.
I'm glad to be with you.
I have, of course, a million things I think we could probably talk about. And since it is Love Your Lawyer Day, I want to thank you for being a lawyer. And I was just in a Twitter conversation where people were saying, you know, if you told me 2 years ago the lawyers were going to save us, I don't know if I would have believed it. But it seems like lawyers are becoming increasingly important these days.
It really is, pretty remarkable. I think from the earliest days of the Muslim ban, lawyers stepped up, and there's a new appreciation for the work we do. So a good silver lining to the times we live in.
Maybe just really briefly, could you talk a little bit about sort of how you got into law and a little bit about your background in public service law?
So I went to law school, I think like so many people do, because I was interested in politics. I was interested in government, but not from a partisan viewpoint. I was much more attracted to constitutional principles and rule of law, and had the great good fortune, even from my earliest years in a big law firm in Washington, Arendt, Fox, Kintner, Plotkin, and Kahn, to have the opportunity to work pro bono on civil rights plaintiffs' cases. One of the first cases I got to work on was a class action lawsuit challenging racial discrimination in a governmental entity. So I had that early on mentorship and guidance and encouragement to do that work. And it was a natural fit when I went over to the U.S. Attorney's Office as a young prosecutor and worked on a lot of our criminal civil rights cases there.
Did you ever think that we would be in a situation like today where lawyers were going to be so important in not just sort of protecting people's rights, but in fact protecting people's rights sort of from the government?
I always liked to tell my young prosecutors, and I tell my students now, that federal prosecutors, the work that they do every day is civil rights work. They're in the business of protecting people's civil rights. And that might mean that prosecutors who are charged with putting people in prison actually have to be the ones who make sure that agents follow constitutional principles when they're arresting, when they're questioning, and when they're gathering evidence. I think from that inside viewpoint, it comes as no surprise to me that lawyers are protecting people's civil rights. What I never anticipated was that it would happen in this direct fashion with the president, in effect, leading the charge.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned, from the Muslim ban that lawyers have stepped up. And so it's occurred to me recently that, a lot of us are following what lawyers do much more closely these days, but I still don't have a good handle on kind of what that process looks like. So if there is something where the attorney general or the president issues an order that is deemed eventually to be unconstitutional, I don't know who sort of makes that case that it should be unconstitutional, who they take that to, what that process looks like. So can you talk us through that a little bit?
Yeah, that's a really great question, because lawyers aren't suddenly just doing this under the Trump administration. It has always gone on. It's just that it's been more in the shadows. And the process is very decentralized. The first really line of challenge to unconstitutional laws has always been the Justice Department, whether that's centralized in Washington, whether it's the Solicitor General who makes the decision a law needs to be challenged, or folks in the criminal, civil rights, civil division who go to the Solicitor General, or often the experience that I had in Alabama challenging Alabama's HB 56, the anti-immigration bill, where we went to Washington and said, this law has some constitutional issues, we really need to challenge it. So that's traditionally, historically been sort of the first place. There's also a very decentralized civil rights community made up of organizations that people are now very familiar with. The ACLU, the Legal Defense Fund of the NAACP, the Southern Poverty Law Center in my home state, and a number of groups that advocate for civil rights across the country. These days, MALDIF and other immigrant coalitions play an important role. The Sikh Alliance, the Anti-Defamation League, a whole lot of groups. And so challenges can come out of any one of those groups. They virtually all have skilled litigators these days. It's essentially boots on the ground. The people who see the problem will often bring the first challenge. And what I notice increasingly is that people work together. There's a tremendous group called the Leadership Conference for Civil Rights. It's headed by a woman named Vanita Gupta, who was the last head of the Civil Rights Division at Justice Department during the Obama administration. She coordinates the groups in a way that's really unprecedented as a response to the times we live in. And so increasingly, we see this very coordinated, focused, sophisticated civil rights litigation, voting rights litigation taking place.
And so that litigation then goes to circuit courts, goes to, I keep hearing about the Ninth Circuit Court. So what does that sort of look like?
Yeah. So it starts out, and I'm going to sort of speak with a broad brush because there are exceptions. Typically, you start in a trial court. That can sometimes be a state trial court. More typically, it's a federal district court. And you have to go all the way through that process until the judge issues a final order or some other appealable order. And then the case is appealed to one of the essentially 12 courts of appeals in this country. There are 11, and then a specialized court in the District of Columbia. And so you have that route of appeal, and that's to a 3-judge panel, not just a single panel. And then either party typically can request an appeal to the Supreme Court of the United States through a mechanism called certiorari, and the Supreme Court has discretion over whether to hear those cases or not. The one exception I should probably point out is that voting cases in certain areas sometimes are dealt with by a special panel rather than a traditional trial mechanism. Has that been confusing enough?
I think it makes a little more sense to me now.
But I think the good point is we really depend on the independence and the integrity of the federal judiciary. And the tradition in this country has been that our judges are appointed by presidents. They, in many ways, get there because they have some political pull, and we expect them to set that aside once they're on the bench and issue their rulings solely on the basis of the law.
And so the big law question this week that has come up is this idea of birthright citizenship, with President Trump saying that he's going to issue an executive order doing away with birthright citizenship. So first of all, can the president do that? Can the president make an executive order that says such a thing? And then if he does, what is the process to challenge that?
Right. I think in the time of Trump, the questions are a little bit different, because in the past we would say, can the president do that? And we would really be talking about, is it lawful for the president to do that? Now we know this issue of can the president do that has very little to do with lawfulness and fully vetting a decision before it's taken. And it's just a question of, can the president theoretically do this? I'm sure the president can issue any executive order that he wants to. But in this case, if he does issue an order terminating birthright citizenship, he will run hard and fast into the 14th Amendment, which makes it abundantly clear in plain and simple language that people who are born in this country are American citizens. Even the same Supreme Court that issued the Plessy v. Ferguson decision, a decision that was historically wrong and that said that separate but equal schooling was legal, even that same Supreme Court supported birthright citizenship, found that it issued in the Constitution. So we have this remarkable situation in progress where Republicans, the party of strict construction, people who for decades have said, we must follow every word in the Constitution and we must do it strictly. And they've used that on a number of different fronts, for instance, gun rights. And now suddenly they're being asked to follow a president who says, let's ignore what's in the 14th Amendment. And I have to believe that that will be a bridge too far for even many of Trump's staunch supporters, who, after all, have all taken an oath to uphold the Constitution.
One would hope.
any challenge in the courts will be swift, and I feel very comfortable that the courts would say that an executive order that did that could not stand.
Yeah, I don't even know how an order like that would be written. How far back does this go? My grandmother was not a citizen when my dad was born.
Right? The retroactivity question is fascinating because it invokes both, can you strip people of citizenship? And then what's the impact for people like you, where if your parent would, not have been a citizenship given this sort of retroactive process? So it's unworkable, it's unconstitutional, it's bad policy. I suspect we won't hear a whole lot about it after the midterms. I think that this is just red meat being thrown at the base to see if they'll bite.
So you mentioned that historically, traditionally, federal judges are appointed by the president and then they work independently after that. Is that still, do you think, what we're seeing? Is there something we should be watching for in what's happening with judicial appointments?
Let me tell you, I still tend to be a believer in the independent judiciary. And I think that individual judges who have the credentials to get confirmed will strive to do their job once they take the bench. But we have seen some disturbing trends in this presidency. There has been a rush to confirm judges to seats that in many cases were held open by the Republicans for the last 2 or 3 years of President Obama's term. I think that that's discouraging, that they manipulated those openings for political advantage. The other problem that we've had is there have been a number of candidates who they've had to withdraw because they lack the credentials, and a number of others who have had serious challenges made both to their qualifications, but also to their temperament. For instance, judges who would not go on record as saying Brown versus Board of Education, which guaranteed Black children the same rights to education as white children, judges who would not go on record as saying that that was a good decision. So maybe there are some issues, but my hope is that once these people take the bench, their elder brethren and sistren on the bench really do a good job of making sure that traditional, objective, and independent judiciary is preserved.
Is there anything that we as citizens outside that process should be doing, should be watching for? Are there red flags that we might see?
Yeah, I think that there is. The way that you become a federal judge is you get appointed by the president, but you have to be confirmed by the Senate. And that typically means that the Senate does at least some marginal evaluation of these folks. And when a candidate comes along who's temperamentally unfit or who has demonstrated bias that concerns us that judge won't be fair when they take the bench, then I think citizens need to engage with their senators, particularly home state senators, but all senators, and express their view about the judge and ask the senator to take a good, hard look at their merits. We see that happen in the Supreme Court process. And I'm not suggesting, by the way, that we should politicize the process, because I think it's important to look at judges based on their qualifications. But perhaps as citizens, we need to encourage our senators not to rubber stamp the pick of the party that they come from, but to ensure that this is someone who will be fair to all of their constituents once they take the bench.
So speaking of judges, your husband is a judge.
He is. He's running for Chief Justice of Alabama's Supreme Court. He's currently a trial judge, a circuit judge in Jefferson County, running to be the Supreme Court Chief Justice.
Okay, and so this is a different process then. We have federal judges that are appointed by a president and confirmed by a Senate, but within states then we have some judges who are in fact voted on.
Right. And it's difficult. In some states, judges run without affiliation to a political party. In Alabama, judges run with either an R or a D after their name, and that's distressing to a lot of lawyers. Our judiciary should never be a political product, but that's the system that we have.
I live in Chicago, where a huge portion of our ballot every time is judges, and I think gets overlooked by a lot of people. People just sort of get to the judge section and leave it all blank or vote yes on everybody, because it's a lot. It's a lot for sort of regular citizens who don't know a lot about the judiciary to sort of sort out and figure out who they should be voting for.
I think that's right. And lawyers have an obligation to help educate their communities about judges. For instance, in my husband Bob's race, a number of Republican former Supreme Court justices and also Republican judges have come forward to say, you know, Judge Vance is a good judge. He's not political. He just rules on the law and gets the job done. And that's the kind of judge we need. As lawyers, we really have an obligation where judges are elected to talk to our communities. A judge in Jefferson County, who I think is just a fantastic judge. She's a criminal judge who's done a lot of really important reform work, and she happens to be a Republican. So I've been really outspoken with friends and voters to make it clear that I think that she's a really good pick, that I'm not voting for judges because they're Republicans or Democrats, but because they honor the rule of law.
And are elections like this, elections for things like Chief Justice, are they as ugly as the rest of politics is right now? You know, we're seeing, especially right now, this close to the election, so many attack ads from people in places where people won't debate and things like that. Is that also true in these kind of campaigns?
So historically, that's been true in Alabama. I remember this one. It was a huge postcard that they mailed the last time my husband ran. And it was this sort of grainy, ugly picture of him as a puppet marionette with President Obama pulling the strings, which we laughed about hysterically, right? Because President Obama was no more compelling Bob's rulings in a courtroom than anybody else was. But that's the sort of thing that gets done. I think it's regrettable. I suspect we'll see that again in these Alabama races as we head into this weekend before the election. But I think that voters are smart and voters understand that people who run ads like that are trying to manipulate them, not help them make a decision about who the right judge to vote for is.
So in Alabama, you do not have early voting. And so everyone who is voting in Alabama is going to be voting on Tuesday.
You can obtain an absentee ballot. That's the only mechanism for early voting if, for instance, you'll be out of state or sick, stuff like that. But typically, almost all of the voting happens between 7 and 7 on Election Day.
Do you anticipate there are places where there will be really long lines or problems with that kind of system?
Yes, I think we will have problems. One problem that we've already seen in the last week and been making an effort to deal with involves college students who've registered to vote and who've been placed on the inactive voting list. Technically, that means that they can still go in and vote. They'll have to sign an update form. And although the Secretary of State and others have said it's not a big deal, it really is a big deal because it takes a lot of extra time. It's confusing. If you're a student and you've got an hour and a half to vote, you can't stick around for 3 hours. In a lot of the counties, the poll workers aren't completely up to speed on the rules, and so they'll give people on the inactive list a provisional ballot instead of a regular ballot, which involves additional hoops to jump through. And the whole point of this, I think what it comes down to, is that in this country, voting is a right. It's not a privilege. You shouldn't have to jump through hoops like this. So even though some of this suppression that goes on is technically legal, it's reprehensible. And we need to do more to make it easy for people to vote, not make it more difficult for them.
The current Alabama Secretary of State, John Merrill, is notoriously sort of terrible on Twitter. I actually got in an argument with him on Twitter last weekend, along with, I think, everyone else in the country. But yeah, I mean, I think this is certainly a place where the Secretary of State seems to have a lot of power and seems to be doing a lot of things to suppress the vote, while simultaneously doing things like blocking constituents on social media.
Yeah, it's interesting. You know, Alabama already has an ID law in effect, which means you have to have certain specified forms of identification to vote. One situation I was involved a 90-year-old woman who had voted in every election she'd ever been eligible to vote in, but suddenly found herself without a valid driver's license and had to get a state-issued ID, but didn't have the mobility to go to the fourth floor registrar's office in the county she lived in. And so Secretary of State technically makes available this mechanism where there's a mobile unit, but it wouldn't come to her house individually, and it was really a struggle to get identification. There are just so many examples of ways that we make it difficult for people to vote. And then politicians, berate people for low turnout. We really need to look at some form of easy registration for everybody when they turn 18. There's so very little voter fraud that goes on in this country. It's not statistically significant. The amount of suppression that goes on is significant, and it is the problem.
You have 4 children. Are any of them now voting age?
3.
Are they excited to be voting this time around?
They are always excited to be voting. Our kids have always voted from the earliest date that they were available, and voting days in our family, much like for me growing up, have always been a family event where even before the kids could vote, we took them to the polls with us, talked with them about how important voting was, and sealed the deal with often a really good breakfast afterwards. So I feel bad for our 15-year-old who can't vote this time, but will be along for the ride.
My 7-year-old tried to convince me that we should lower the voting age to 4 so he and his little brother could vote.
I think that's wonderful. One thing that we need to do is we need to raise a generation of voters. And look, as a U.S. attorney in Alabama, I knew that when I was doing voting rights litigation, probably a lot more people who were Republicans would become enabled to vote than Democrats. It was never about the politics. It never is for me. I think that we live in a participatory, democracy. If we want to keep the constitutional republic that the founding fathers gave us, then we all need to engage. We all need to vote.
All right. So the last thing I wanted to talk to you about is knitting, which is always one of the most important topics of any conversation.
Absolutely. Yes.
So I understand that you used to run a small yarn dyeing business.
I did. My grandmother actually taught me how to dye when I was a kid. And at some point, I don't even remember when now, I had dyed some yarn for friends, and they started hammering me about dyeing and selling it. And almost just as a lark, I put a little bit of it up on Etsy. And for a while, had a really nice hobby business on the side.
And then, do I understand correctly that you stopped selling it so there wouldn't be a conflict of interest?
Yeah, so this is, I guess it's really interesting in light of the Trump administration and ethical standards there. One of the conditions prior to my appointment as U.S. Attorney was that I completely shuttered that business to avoid any possibility of a conflict of interest, which I did.
And so are you knitting much these days?
I've actually been knitting a little bit less for the last couple of weeks than usual, but I'm constantly knitting. I can't say how much yarn because then my husband would find out in a walk-in closet in a room downstairs. And I actually have I've got a hat that I'm in the middle of knitting and a couple of sweaters, but I've also got a couple of new projects planned to cast on this weekend to knit on for election night.
That's excellent. I have a huge queue of things I want to get back to knitting once we're not podcasting every day of the week.
Right. I think we'll all be much more efficient knitters after this election.
I think, absolutely. I find that knitters in general seem to be very, very logical people, very rational people who, whatever their political beliefs may be, seem to care about other people. I think maybe that's part of, being someone who will take the time to create something from scratch for another person. There seems to be something about the knitting community.
Knitters never ask if you're a Republican or a Democrat before they give you help. They just want to see you succeed. And so people who have very different beliefs work successfully together. Maybe we need more knitters in government.
Hey, I'm all for that. Let's start the knitters party.
I like that. I'm all for that. We're starting it here, and right now, knitters are uniting.
All right, I'm going to run for president on in part of the knitter party.
Outstanding. I'm with you.
All right. Is there anything else that you wanted to be sure we talked about?
I think we've covered the waterfront, don't you?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. All we can do now is, get out the vote and make sure that if we've got friends or neighbors, and especially young people who might need a nudge to go out and vote for the first time, that we make sure everyone gets out there and exercises their right to vote while they still have it.
All right. Well, Joyce, thank you so much for joining me today. This has been really fun, and I hope to get back to a time when our rights are not so much under attack and lawyers can go back to, sort of the quiet job.
Maybe next time we can talk only about knitting, because there will be no more need to talk about the other stuff, but I sort of doubt it.
Yeah. That's a lovely thought, though.
Thanks for listening to Two Broads Talking Politics. Our theme song is called Are You Listening? Off of the album Elephant Shaped Trees by the band Immunuri, and we're using it with permission of the band. Our logo and other original artwork is by Matthew Weflin and was created for use by this podcast.